The desert sun burns without mercy. Sand shimmers, air trembles, and water vanishes before it can touch the ground. Out here, ice is unthinkable. There are no glaciers to carve, no rivers to chill, no modern machines humming with cold air. Only heat, dryness, and the endless horizon. And yet, people lived here for centuries. Tribes crossed these landscapes with herds of goats, sacks of grain, and jars of milk. They survived for weeks, even months, carrying food that somehow stayed fresh in a place that should have devoured it within hours. Dates lasted through long journeys, butter stayed solid, grain kept safe from mold. How? How did they outwit a land built to destroy every perishable thing? The answers are as brilliant as they are unexpected. The first secret to cooling food in the desert was as old as the earth itself: clay. Tribes discovered that the very material beneath their feet could become a tool against the heat. Shaped into jars and pots, clay containers did something remarkable. They breathed. Unlike metal or polished stone, unglazed clay was porous, and water seeped slowly through its walls. As the desert sun struck the pot, that thin layer of water evaporated, pulling heat away with it. What was left inside the jar cooled, as if the pot itself had learned how to sweat. In the searing dryness of the desert, this effect became even more powerful. In wetter climates, air is already heavy with moisture, and evaporation is slower. But in the Sahara, Arabia, or Persia, the air begged to drink water. The moment it touched the surface of a clay pot, evaporation accelerated. The science was simple, but the effect was profound. A jar of milk left in the open air would spoil within hours. Sealed inside a clay vessel that sweated under the sun, it could last days longer. Dates, butter, and even water itself stayed cooler, fresher, and safer. This method was so effective that it spread across regions and centuries. In North Africa, clay amphorae stored olives and oils, keeping them cool beneath the relentless sun. In Arabia, milk was poured into clay jugs buried halfway in the sand, where the cooling process was amplified by the earth's shade. In Persia, potters perfected wide-bellied jars with narrow necks, designed not just to hold but to shield contents from heat while evaporation did its work. These weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. Travelers and merchants quickly learned to trust them. A caravan moving across the Sahara might carry hundreds of clay jars strapped to camels, each one a silent, sweating guardian of food and drink. By day, the sun scorched their path, but the jars bled off heat, cooling what they carried. By night, when the desert cold crept in, the clay hardened and held the chill, preserving food for the next day's journey. Even the design of villages reflected this knowledge. Houses were built with alcoves carved into shaded walls, each niche holding a clay pot where food stayed cooler than the surrounding air. Families stored water in these vessels not only because it remained fresh, but because it tasted cleaner, cooled just enough to soothe a parched throat. The sound of dripping, the touch of damp clay, the faint coolness against dry lips, all of these became part of daily life. The brilliance of this method lay in its simplicity. No moving parts, no external fuel, just clay, air, and water working together. And it wasn't a temporary solution. Some of the very same principles are used today in Zier pots or pot-in-pot refrigerators. 2 clay pots, one nestled inside the other with wet sand packed between them, can keep vegetables fresh for weeks without a single watt of electricity. A trick born in the desert thousands of years ago still saves lives in modern villages where power lines do not reach. For ancient desert tribes, though, the clay jar was only the beginning. It solved the problem of hours, sometimes days. But what if you needed more? What if food had to last weeks on the march or months through the shifting seasons? Clay alone could not answer that. For that, the tribes turned to the earth itself, building storage not in the sun but beneath it. But what if you needed to keep food cold for weeks, not just hours? If the desert sun was merciless above, the earth below offered a secret refuge. Tribes quickly learned that while sand and rock baked in daylight, dig deep enough, and the temperature dropped. Beneath the surface, the soil held coolness, a natural shield against the extremes above. To survive, ancient desert peoples turned the ground into their refrigerator. The simplest method was the storage pit. Families dug holes in shaded areas, lined them with straw or palm leaves, and lowered baskets of food inside. Covered with wood or stone, then buried under sand, these pits could stay several degrees cooler than the open air. Dates, figs, and grain stored this way resisted rot for weeks longer than if they had been left above ground. The silence of the underground, cut off from scorching winds, kept food safe while the sun raged above. But tribes did not stop with shallow pits. In rocky landscapes, they carved entire chambers. Underground caves and cisterns became storage vaults, where butter hardened and cheese firmed in the constant coolness. In the Middle East, natural caves doubled as pantries, their damp air helping to keep supplies fresh. In Iran and Arabia, deep cisterns used for water storage also doubled as food storage, with jars of milk and oil stacked beside the water's edge. These hidden spaces were more than convenience. In a land where a single spoiled sack of grain could mean hunger, they were security. The method worked because the earth was stable. While the surface swung violently between burning days and freezing nights, the soil beneath stayed steady. A pit dug just a few feet deep might remain at 60 or 65 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the air above soared past 100 by day and dropped near freezing by night. That steady middle ground was the perfect environment to protect fragile food. In some regions, underground coolers became communal. Villages built shared storage pits, guarded carefully. Where families placed their food, straw and ash were often layered over the contents to keep pests away. In parts of North Africa, entire underground silos known as matmuras were dug into hillsides, their narrow mouths sealed with stone to keep heat and thieves out. A matmura could hold grain for years, feeding a community long after harvest. Archaeologists still find remnants of these silos, some more than 1,000 years old, proof of how deeply desert societies trusted the earth to guard their food. The ingenuity stretched into architecture as well. In Tunisia, underground houses were built not only for people but also for storage. Cool chambers carved into soft rock sheltered jars of olive oil and sacks of flour. In the Middle East, labyrinthine underground cities held both people and provisions, safe from raiders and the sun alike. Food stored there was not only cool but secure, hidden from the dangers that stalked the desert surface. Even today, echoes of these techniques survive. In Yemen, some families still bury clay jars of butter and laban beneath the floor, where the temperature stays cool even in sweltering summers. In rural parts of Jordan and Oman, underground storage pits are used for dates, allowing families to eat from last season's harvest months later. The method is timeless because it requires nothing more than patience, labour, and trust in the earth. To step into one of these storage chambers after hours in the desert heat must have felt miraculous. The shift was instant, the dry oven above replaced by the damp chill of stone and soil. The air smelled of straw, grain, and earth. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint drip of water or the shuffle of baskets against rock. In a world of extremes, this cool, steady quiet was life-preserved. But as remarkable as the earth was, some tribes went even further. They did not just dig into the ground, they built structures designed to bend the desert itself, pulling wind and air into systems that cooled entire chambers. And some tribes built entire structures designed just to fight the heat. The desert wind is a paradox. By day it scalds, carrying dust and heat across endless sand. By night it chills, rushing cold through tents and stone valleys. For most travellers, the wind was another enemy to endure. But for some desert societies, the wind became a tool, a force to tame, redirect, and transform into cool air. This was the genius of the windcatcher. The windcatcher, or badger as it was called in ancient Persia, was a tower rising above rooftops, tall and slender with open slits facing the horizon. At first glance it looked decorative, a strange fin-like structure breaking the line of mud brick walls. But its purpose was entirely practical. When wind struck its openings, the tower funneled the air downward into the building below. Hot air outside became a cooling draft inside, flowing through rooms and courtyards. The design worked in reverse too. If air inside grew stifling, the tower pulled it upward, venting heat away. By harnessing nothing more than the desert wind and the principle of convection, these towers turned unbearable heat into livable coolness. The effect was most striking when paired with water. In many Persian cities, windcatchers connected to underground cisterns or channels of water called qanats. Air rushing past the surface of the water cooled as it travelled, chilling entire chambers below ground. Food stored in those chambers, milk, butter, fruit, grain, stayed fresh far longer than the desert climate should have allowed. People living above benefited as well. Families rested in cool rooms while their supplies were guarded in the same breath of air. The scale of some of these systems was astonishing. In Yazd, Iran, windcatchers rose above almost every rooftop, feeding air into basements where water storage kept the draft cold. In the heat of midsummer, when outside temperatures soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the rooms cooled by wind catchers might rest at 70. Entire cities became livable in climates that should have been unbearable. But the principle was not limited to grand architecture. Desert tribes and nomads adapted smaller versions. Instead of tall towers, they raised woven screens or angled tent flaps to channel wind into shaded storage spaces. Clay jars were positioned in the draft, their evaporative cooling amplified by the constant movement of air. Goat skins filled with milk or water were hung in breezeways, cooled enough to last another day's journey. What cities perfected in towers, tribes improvised with canvas, reed, and instinct. Archaeological evidence suggests that some windcatcher-like designs appeared more than 500 years ago, their origins stretching deep into antiquity. The survival of these systems speaks to their effectiveness. In a time without machines, without ice, without electricity, a tower of mud brick could create a climate of its own. To step into a chamber cooled by a windcatcher was to feel the desert itself subdued, transformed from tormentor into servant. Travellers wrote of the experience with awe. Merchants crossing Persia in the Middle Ages described arriving at caravanserais, rest stops along desert routes, where windcatchers funneled cool air into underground chambers. Food, water, and weary bodies were revived in the chill. For those who had endured weeks of scorching wind and burning sand, the draft of a badgear must have felt like magic, proof that human design could outwit the desert. The principle spread across regions. In Egypt, similar structures guided air through homes and granaries. In the Gulf, narrow towers were built into fortresses and mosques, cooling not just supplies but worshippers. Even in parts of Arabia, nomads constructed small wind tunnels lined with stone to protect food from rot. The desert had many shapes, but the wind was everywhere, and so was the idea of catching it. What made wind catchers extraordinary was not just their ingenuity but their sustainability. They required no fire, no fuel, no constant labour. They were passive systems, relying on natural forces to create relief. In many ways, they were ancient air conditioning, centuries before the modern world even imagined such a thing, and unlike modern machines, they left no trace but the tower itself, standing silent against the sky. The ingenuity of the windcatcher reflected something deeper about desert life. Survival here was never about brute strength alone. It was about listening, watching, and learning from the environment. The wind that blistered skin could also cool water. The sun that killed crops could also dry fruit into preserves. Every enemy could be turned into an ally with the right knowledge. The badgear was not just a structure, it was a philosophy of adaptation. But the desert tribes had more than towers. They had the night itself. When the sun dipped and the temperature plunged, they found another way to draw cold from a land built on heat. But they did not just use air, they mastered water and the desert's own extremes. The desert is a land of extremes. By day, it scorches. By night, it chills. The same ground that burns your feet in the afternoon can feel like ice beneath your hands after midnight. These violent swings were dangerous for the unprepared, but for ancient desert tribes, they became another secret weapon. If the sun destroyed food, the night could preserve it. One of the simplest tricks was timing. Foods like milk or fresh butter were consumed quickly in the day, when heat threatened to spoil them, but at night they were left outside in skin bags or clay jars. The temperature drop cooled them enough to survive until morning. Even a few hours of chill could make the difference between sour milk and a drinkable supply. For families on the move, this routine became as essential as setting up camp. The desert punished carelessness, but it rewarded awareness. Goatskins were particularly useful. Flexible and durable, they could hold milk, butter, or water, and when left out overnight, the contents cooled. Caravans crossing long routes through Arabia or the Sahara often relied on this method. A skin of milk set on the sand at dusk might still be drinkable the next day, a small miracle in a climate designed to destroy it. Some tribes even buried skins lightly in the cooling sand, trapping the night chill to carry into morning. In some deserts, the effect was even more dramatic. The skies were so clear and the air so dry that heat escaped rapidly into space after sunset. Temperatures plunged low enough for thin films of ice to form on ponds, even in regions where the daytime sun could kill within hours. Ancient records from Persia, Syria, and even parts of North Africa mention villagers collecting ice at dawn, scraping it from shallow pools or stone basins. This ice was precious, stored carefully in insulated pits or wrapped in straw for use in cooling drinks or treating fevers. The sight of ice in a desert landscape must have felt like witnessing the impossible, a gift of the night stolen before the sun could reclaim it. In Persia, this principle was developed into a science. Shallow stone pools were constructed outside cities, designed to capture maximum heat loss overnight. Water spread thin across their surfaces froze by dawn. The ice was then carried to underground ice houses, called yakchals, where it could last for months, preserved by thick walls of mud brick and ash. While this was a more urban solution, the concept sprang directly from the natural desert cycle. Heat by day, cold by night, and the human ability to trap both for survival. For nomads, the practice was less elaborate but no less vital. Milk cooled at night and consumed by morning kept families alive on journeys where no other refrigeration was possible. Grains and dates stored outside at night shed some of the day's heat, making them safer to eat in the morning. Even water, when cooled under starlight, tasted fresher, a psychological relief as much as a physical one. To sip cool water after a day of scorching thirst was to feel, for a moment, like the desert itself had been tamed. But the night's cold was fleeting. By mid-morning, the sun reclaimed its dominance, heating sand and stone until they radiated fire. Cooling food at night bought time, but never permanence. The tribes needed more than patience. They needed transformation. This is where preservation blurred into refrigeration. By drying meat into jerky, fermenting milk into yogurt, or pressing fruits into pastes, they created foods that resisted spoilage, using the desert's own heat as an ally. When combined with clay jars, underground pits, and the cold of the night, these preserved foods became a bulwark against hunger. It was not one method alone, but all of them together that allowed survival. The desert was unforgiving, but it also offered tools. Tribes learned to use its fire and its frost, its wind and its earth, weaving them together into a system that turned impossibility into routine. For every challenge, the land provided an answer, if only you knew where to look. Still, food could not always remain fresh. Sometimes it had to change form entirely, transformed from perishable to durable, from fragile to lasting. That was the true genius of desert survival. Still, the desert was unforgiving, so food itself had to be transformed. When the desert stripped away comfort and time, tribes answered with transformation. Fresh food, fragile in the heat, was remade into something that could last weeks or months. Preservation was not only survival, it was ingenuity, turning the very conditions of the desert into tools for endurance. Meat, the most vulnerable of all, was dried into strips. Thin cuts were laid out under the blazing sun or over slow fires, the moisture drawn out until they became tough, salty, and nearly imperishable. What spoiled in hours as raw flesh could now survive for weeks as jerky. Hunters and caravans alike carried these strips wrapped in cloth, chewing them slowly on long journeys. The texture was harsh, but it carried strength. Each bite was a triumph over heat and time. Milk, too, was reshaped. In climates where fresh milk spoiled in a single day, women turned it into yogurt, sour milk, or cheese. These forms resisted decay and grew richer in flavor as they aged. Nomadic Bedouins in Arabia made Laban, a soured yogurt drink that refreshed under the sun and lasted longer than milk itself. Hard cheeses, sometimes called desert cheese, were dried until they could be stored for months. They were tough, needing to be soaked before eating, but they carried nutrition across endless miles of sand. A skin bag of milk might sour overnight. A wheel of dried cheese could outlast a season. Fruits became another lifeline. Dates were already durable, their thick skins protecting them against rot. But tribes pressed them into dense pastes, packed into jars or wrapped in palm leaves. This concentrate provided sweetness and energy long after fresh fruit was gone. Figs were dried in the same way, their sugars crystallizing into a storage food that endured both travel and scarcity. To eat one was to taste sunlight stored, a reminder that even the desert could offer luxury if you knew how to capture it. Salt was another ally. Fish caught along coasts or rivers were gutted, packed in salt, and dried. These became staples carried far inland, traded along caravan routes to places where water barely existed. Salted fish appeared in markets of North Africa and Arabia, proof that preservation could extend food across entire regions. The desert might have been dry, but it connected to seas, and preserved fish made the journey inland where fresh catches never could. Grain, the foundation of many diets, was also stored with care. Ground into flour and baked into hard bread, it became nearly indestructible. Travellers carried these dense loaves on long routes, softening them with water or milk when it was time to eat. Combined with dried fruits or cheese, they formed meals that required no fire, no fresh harvest, only patience and endurance. Preservation did more than protect against hunger. It shaped culture. Foods born out of necessity became traditions, passed from mother to daughter, woven into identity. Yogurt drinks, dried cheeses, pressed date cakes, these were not just survival tools but symbols of belonging. To taste them was to taste heritage, to join a line of ancestors who had learned to outlast the desert. The genius lay in combination. A traveller might leave at dawn with milk cooled overnight, jerky dried from the week before, and dates stored in a clay jar. Each method covered the weakness of another. When milk soured, cheese remained. When fruit ran out, grain filled the gap. When heat threatened, preservation stood guard. Together, they formed a web of survival strong enough to hold against the desert's worst. And though these methods were ancient, they echo in kitchens today. Laban is still drunk in the Middle East. Dried dates remain staples of Ramadan. Salted fish appears in markets from Morocco to Oman. What began as necessity became cuisine, a reminder that survival and culture often grow from the same root. But the desert never stopped testing its people. Sometimes even preservation and cooling were not enough. Caravans crossed for weeks. Villages faced droughts that lasted years. To endure, tribes combined every method they had, layering clay jars, underground storage, night cooling, and preserved food into a single strategy. Survival was not one trick, it was all of them at once. And sometimes, they had to combine all of these methods at once. Methods alone do not tell the full story. To understand the brilliance of desert survival, you have to see them in action, carried out under the weight of hunger, heat, and endless miles of sand. The ingenuity of clay jars, underground pits, and preserved food was tested not in theory but in journeys where every mistake could mean death. Caravans crossing the Sahara were among the greatest trials. Hundreds of camels loaded with salt, cloth, or spices set out across a sea of dunes that stretched beyond the horizon. Water was rationed with care, each skin counted. Dates became the lifeblood of these journeys. Their sugar fueled men and animals alike, and their durability made them perfect for weeks on the move. Stored in clay jars or pressed into pastes, they endured heat that would have destroyed softer fruits in hours. Alongside them, milk cooled overnight in skins, yogurt soured into Laban, and hard bread carried from the last village. These foods might not have been luxurious, but they were steady, lasting long enough to see caravans across the desert's spine. For nomadic Bedouins, survival meant making do with what could be carried. Milk from camels and goats was turned into laban, drunk fresh when possible and soured when not. Butter was churned in skin bags swung from saddles as camels walked, then buried underground to harden in the cool soil. Dried cheese, rock-hard and compact, was carried as a reserve. Salted fish from coastal markets sometimes travelled inland in saddlebags, traded across distances where fresh food was impossible. These supplies meant that families could move for weeks at a time, grazing animals where pasture still existed, carrying their own resilience in skins and jars. Archaeology leaves its own testimony. In North Africa, fragments of clay cooling pots more than 500 years old show that evaporation was already harnessed long before modern science explained it. In Persia, the ruins of Yakchals, massive domed ice houses, stand as monuments to a culture that captured winter itself and stored it in summer. Underground silos found in Tunisia and Morocco still hold traces of grain, sealed by earth for decades. These remnants tell us that ingenuity was not occasional, it was constant, woven into the architecture of daily life. Travellers and historians also recorded these methods. Medieval accounts describe merchants in Persia resting at caravanserais, where windcatchers cooled rooms and underground chambers stored butter and cheese. In Arabia, outsiders marvelled at how milk survived days in desert tents, cooled by goatskins left in the night air. In the Sahara, European explorers often relied on the same methods as local guides, drinking Laban and eating dried meat that had preserved the lives of caravans for centuries. What seemed strange to outsiders was ordinary genius to those who had always lived with the desert. Every story reveals the same truth. Survival was not luck, it was skill, memory, and innovation carried forward through generations. A girl growing up in a desert village learned how to pack dates with palm leaves, how to churn butter by walking, how to store food under straw in a pit. These lessons were not optional. They were inheritance. The knowledge of how to keep food alive was as essential as water itself. And perhaps the most remarkable part is that these techniques were not only about endurance, they were about trust in the land itself. The desert seemed merciless, yet its winds could be caught, its earth could be hollowed, its nights could be harvested for cold. To live here was to learn that even in the harshest environment, survival could be crafted from the very forces that threatened it. But these were not just stories of the past. Some of these methods remain alive today, still guarding food in places where modern machines cannot reach. Which raises the final question: what do these ancient tricks mean for us now? So what do these ancient tricks mean for us today? The story of how desert tribes kept food cold without ice does not end in the past. These techniques, born out of necessity, still echo across the world today. They remind us that survival does not always depend on machines or electricity. Sometimes it depends on the simplest elements: clay, wind, earth, and patience. In rural parts of Africa, clay zia pots are still used. 2 jars, one nested inside the other with wet sand packed between, can keep vegetables fresh for weeks. For families without refrigerators, this technology can be the difference between food lasting a day or lasting a season. The principle is unchanged from thousands of years ago. Evaporation steals heat, and clay holds the cool. The method has even been revived by aid groups, offering sustainable low-cost refrigeration to communities far from power lines. Underground storage also survives. In Tunisia, Morocco, and Yemen, families still dig pits or use ancient mat muras to keep grain safe through lean seasons. In Iran, the domed Yakhchal's ice houses, built centuries ago, still stand, silent and enduring. Their design has inspired modern architects interested in sustainable cooling. The idea that you can harvest winter ice and preserve it through the hottest months without electricity feels almost futuristic, though it belongs to the ancient world. The foods themselves also endure. Laban is still drunk in the Middle East, a sour yogurt that quenches thirst under the sun. Dates remain a staple, especially during Ramadan, where their durability and sweetness continue to carry symbolic and practical weight. Hard cheeses, dried meat, and pressed fruit pastes are still made in villages, not just as traditions but as necessities. These foods, once born of hardship, have become cultural treasures. What is striking is how modern science often circles back to these same methods. Evaporative coolers, underground storage, passive airflow systems all mirror what desert peoples already knew. In an age of rising temperatures and fragile energy systems, these ancient lessons are being studied with fresh urgency. Sustainability is not new. It is very old, written in clay and sand long before power grids existed. But perhaps the greatest legacy is the reminder of human ingenuity itself. The desert is one of the harshest environments on Earth, a place where heat and dryness destroy almost everything. Yet even here, people learned not only to survive but to thrive. They bent the wind, trapped the night, preserved the harvest, and carried life across landscapes that should have been impossible. Their knowledge was not decoration, it was survival, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, ensuring that families endured where logic said they should not. We live now in a world where cold is taken for granted. Open a refrigerator, and you find milk, meat, vegetables, all preserved by humming machines. But step back into the desert past, and you see that cold was once an achievement, created with skill and patience. To understand these methods is to remember that comfort is a luxury built on countless acts of survival. The desert tribes prove something extraordinary. Even in the hottest places on Earth, human ingenuity can create cold where there is none. Thank you for watching Sins of the Past. If you enjoyed this journey through ancient ingenuity, subscribe to the channel because history still holds secrets worth uncovering.